Alright, so a lot of people have asked me how I make bread, and though there are a lot of different ways to do it, you can use a lot of different ingredients. The simplest way that I know that I can always remember the recipe for just takes 4 ingredients: white flour, whole wheat flour, salt, yeast, and some warm water to get started. I like to use unbleached bread flour, mostly because bread flour has an added protein content, so there's more gluten in it. It gives you a little bit more stretch, a little bit more chewiness in the crumb. The whole wheat flour gives a little bit more texture, a little bit more flavor. Let's see, kosher salt or sea salt are the best to use. Anything with iodine in it is going to kill some of the yeast in your dough, so try and avoid anything with iodine. Any sort of packaged yeast, whether it's in a jar or in these packets like this, will suffice. You don't need an entire packet. I usually use about 2 teaspoons. A 1 cup measure, a mixing bowl, a baking pan, and though you don't need it, it really helps to have parchment paper. It just helps to keep things from sticking on the pan. Otherwise, you either have to rub it with butter or some sort of other oil. So let's start out by adding 3 cups of warm water. Now by warm, I mean, let's see, more than just room temperature, but definitely not hot enough that it is uncomfortable to hold your finger under there. So let it warm up a little bit. Probably a good place to start. Just 3 cups. So with 3 cups of water, I use maybe half to 2/3 of the yeast packet. That's probably good. Got a mixing spoon here. Just let it all dissolve in there and mix in with the water. And the yeast will start to activate in the warm water. Now add about a tablespoon of salt. I'm not very careful about the measurement. There's a bit of a margin for error in this, the way there isn't with the flour and the water. Stir that all in so that you don't see any granules of anything in your water. And from there you can immediately start adding your white flour. So the very easy ratios to remember is about 1 tablespoon of yeast, 1 tablespoon of salt, 3 cups of water, and 6 cups of flour. So it's a 2-to-1 ratio of water to flour. Keeping those ratios in mind, you can double the batch if you want to make more at one time. The thing is, the overall time that it takes to make bread is about 6 hours. But the time where you're actually interacting with the ingredients or doing anything is maybe 20 to 30 minutes. It's not significant. So it's actually really easy to make. You just have to wait while it rises and proofs. And you will get flour dust on everything. It's just part of the process. Alright, so I started just by adding 3 cups of the flour, and I'm mixing it into a paste. I'm going to let this sit in a nice warm spot with the bowl covered. And what this allows the dough to do is have the yeast kind of grow up and proliferate inside of the dough, allow the glutens to sort of bind and mature, and then we'll add the last 3 cups of flour after about, I don't know, an hour or so of letting this just sit. So that's fairly well mixed. Already you can see as those globs are sort of holding together as they fall. That's the gluten, the protein, and the flour that's holding it together. So that is the first step. I'm going to cover this with parchment paper and I'm going to leave it outside because it's significantly warmer outside. We've got the AC on inside the house, and so it's a slower process for the yeast to mature or to grow in a cooler setting. Ideally, you want to leave this to rise and to mature in between about 80 and 90 degrees of room temperature. And since it's about that outside right now here in August in the summer, I'm just going to cover it so that the water doesn't evaporate out and leave it in that warmer spot for the yeast to grow. And we'll come back in about an hour after that's done. Alright, so this is rested outside for an hour in the warmer temperature. And I know it looks a lot larger now, but it's actually not because it's risen. I decided to make a double batch just so that I can give more examples of how to form it once we start doing the proofs. So all I did was the exact same portions as the first time around, added that to the same batch. So that means there's 6 cups of flour in here, there's 6 cups of water. And so we're going to double it. We're going to put in 6 more cups of flour, and that'll give us the consistency for the dough that we need. So I'm going to do about half and half white flour to whole wheat. You can change up the ratio a little bit, but I would say if you go any higher than half of the flour with whole wheat, I would add a little bit of honey. In general, the yeast needs sugars to eat so that it'll proliferate. How many was that there? Was that 2 or 3? I think that was 2 or 3. Yeah. I'm paying attention. And it's harder for the yeast to eat the whole wheat flour. And so adding a little bit of honey, I would say maybe like 2 tablespoons worth, would allow the yeast to propagate a lot better, and you wouldn't get kind of a flat dough, which you might otherwise. 2 and 3 of whole wheat. So that's 6 more cups altogether. Now I'm going to try and fold it over. This part gets a little bit tricky. I'll eventually start mixing it with my hands in order to make sure that there aren't any pockets of flour that haven't gotten mixed in, because that'll mess with the consistency of your dough. But right now I'm just sort of folding it over, and this part will take a little bit of time. But this is probably the most difficult part of making bread, is just getting this final mix in so that the dough is nice and smooth. There are a lot of other flours that you can experiment with once you get comfortable with this basic mix, but this is a good sort of ratio and recipe to keep in mind whenever you're doing simple bread recipes. And you can use this base to start different experiments from there. If you want to add herbs, if you want to add, raisins or cinnamon or other flavorings to your dough, start with this basic recipe and try out different combinations from there. Maybe do smaller batches if you don't know how it's going to turn out. So from here, I'm going to start mixing it with my hands, which I have already washed. And as I'm mixing it in, this is as close to kneading as I'm going to do on this recipe. It doesn't need to be overworked. In fact, when it is overworked, you'll often sort of over-compress the bubbles that are forming as it rises, which means you're going to get a bit of a denser loaf, and that's something you want to avoid. And here's where it gets really sticky. But as we work it and let it rise, it'll dry out a little bit and become easier to work with. You'll also sort of add flour onto the surfaces that you're working with so that it doesn't stick. Really mash it up to make sure that there aren't pockets of dry flour in here. And kind of fold it in over itself. When you're finished there, get the excess off of your hands. You can kind of see the texture and the consistency. It holds together really well and doesn't want to separate, nice and stretchy. Now once I get this off of my hands, we'll put it back outside in the warmer temperature, and this time we'll let it rise for 2 hours. And we should see a pretty big difference in the size of the dough after 2 hours. Alright, so the dough has had time to rise for 2 hours now, and you can see it's grown quite a lot. The top has gotten a little bit dry because the parchment paper that we put on top didn't really stay down, but it's not a big deal. So I'm going to kind of fold it all into the center so that those dry parts kind of get reabsorbed on the inside. You can see the dough already holds together a lot better at this point, but it's still fairly sticky. So for that reason, I'm going to throw a little bit of flour down on the table before I pour it out. And then just scrape all this dough into the center. I'll throw a little bit more flour on the top, and then sort of pat it out in a long stretch that's fairly even on both sides. This way I can kind of estimate proportions of the dough. We're going to make 4 loaves out of this, so I'll cut it down the center. Now some people do this with a scale to make sure that they all weigh the same. I don't have a scale, so I'm just going to estimate. Okay. Now there's a couple of different ways to form it in the end, but we're not going to get to that yet because this is what's going to be called proofing the dough. Get some flour out of there. All you do is throw the ends in, and this is carefully, this is not patting down super hard on the dough because that will break all the air bubbles. And I'm just kind of folding it into the crease at the bottom and making these little slugs. Again, this is still light and fluffy. I didn't pat it down too much. We'll do it with all of these. Fold it into the center and very lightly tuck it into this little slug form. Now I'm going to put some parchment paper down on this baking tin because that will keep the dough from sticking to the bottom of the pan. And I'll just throw again a little bit of flour over the top to further keep it from sticking. And put my loosely formed loaves onto the baking pan. Just do it with the last 2 here. Flour my hands a little so it doesn't stick. Fold it into the center. And you're trying to get an even proportion on both sides. So there's your slug. Now this pin's only going to hold those 3. So I'm going to get out another small baking pan to put this 3rd one on. This will do. We're just going to proof it on this. And parchment paper's here. I'm going to get more parchment paper over the top again so the dough doesn't dry out too much. That'll be enough for the small one. And for the 3. I'm going to put these back outside again to rise a little bit because it's warmer. And I'll probably leave it out there about 20 to 30 minutes. So now that the dough has had a chance to proof, we've got these nicely, fairly preformed balls or slugs of dough. And there's a lot of different forms that you can give to the bread. But because of the size of the pans that I'm putting them in, I'm not going to do any long baguettes or any balls that would kind of take up all the space on the pan. So I'm patting it out just a little bit to get any of the really big bubbles to collapse. And I'm going to do it fairly similar to the original form, but with a little bit of a point at the end. Again, I'm putting it together. This is almost just like the first proof form. But this time I'm going to pull a little bit harder. And you can see on this side, you see that you've got this seam on the bottom. I'm just going to compress that seam while turning the bread in just a little bit so that you form a fairly uniform line that's sealed on the bottom. Now it's not going to stick together because of the flour that I put down earlier, and I'm just going to roll out the corners or the edges just a little bit to get that point. Now I need the space to put these on before I'm able to free up the pan. So I'll just reset it like that. And this time I don't need to put any flour on the parchment paper itself because this is the final form and we're not going to be taking it back off the paper. So I'll throw a little bit more flour down so it doesn't stick while I'm forming it. And you can see the proofs have stuck together a little bit, so I'm just going to pull those apart. It's not a big deal when we're losing our form here. Just got to make sure it doesn't stick too badly. Alright, pat it out just a little bit. Again, not too hard, you don't want to collapse all the bubbles. Tucking it in a little bit. Along this side, you press down with the heel of your hand, which forms a nice seam on the bottom. Make sure that seam goes to the bottom. Roll out the edges a little bit. And you have kind of like this fat baguette. We'll do one more like that, and then we'll do a third a little bit different. Stuck to the paper just a little bit. It takes a second to pry it loose. Toss in the flour again, and this very loose, light, airy texture is a great sign that the dough has proofed correctly. If it was still a little dense or if the dough felt cold, you might either want to leave it out a little bit longer or put it in a warmer space. Pinching down that seam so it holds its form. Rolling out the corners just a bit. And making sure that seam goes down. There's our last final form of bread. And I'll do the same thing for the last one. So got most of it off. And this time I will roll it into a ball because we've got space on that last one. And each time I'm sort of rolling it into itself And once I've gone around a little bit and you start to feel a little bit of a tension, you use the heel of your hand again and roll that bottom in place so it seals off just like the seam on those other loaves. And you can see on the bottom that's pinched together, it's not coming apart. This will rise nice and sort of plump. So once again, we'll put parchment paper over the top so it doesn't dry out too much. Oh, I'll get a bigger piece for that. And once again, I'll set them outside in the warmer temperature so that they rise nicely. Now this one, it's a little bit more important than the other proof. The other proof I left out probably a little bit long this time, maybe about 40 minutes. But for the final form, you definitely want to keep it down to no more than 20 minutes. If it is left too long, it'll lose its form a little bit and start to kind of flatten out as the weight kind of overcomes the airy bubbles on the inside. And then when you bake it, it won't puff up as much as you'd like. So keep the time to between 15-20 minutes and try not to go over. That way your bread will rise nicely when you put it in the oven. Okay, so now that the final form has risen a little bit, and I've preheated my oven to 510 degrees, 500 would be a good minimum. You really want to get the highest temperature that you can in your oven for the best results when the bread bakes. Let's see. I dusted the top with just a little bit of flour, and before I put them in, I'm going to give them some marks like this. You can get artistic with it if you want, but the point is just so that it has sort of more of an aesthetic way of rising. Because if you don't put these, it will split wherever is the weakest part, and your bread won't look quite as nice as it rises. So with these marks, I'm going to put them on the top shelf, or about as high off from the bottom as I can in the oven. I guess this one will go on bottom here. Just unless you have a convection oven, there's a better chance that the base of the bread is going to burn before the top gets crispy. It can vary a little bit by oven. In general, it takes about 20 minutes to finish baking, but I tend to keep an eye on it, and I know to look for sort of a golden brown, almost dark crust, and when that's achieved, then it's finished. The last thing that I do after I've closed the oven for a little minute to let the heat reestablish after opening the oven, I've got just a little bit more than a cup of water here, and this is the fun part. I'm just going to throw this down on the bottom of the oven in order for the interior to steam up. The steam helps to get a crispier crust, and unless you want sort of a chewier kind of sandwich loaf crust, this gets you really good results if you're doing more rustic loaves. So here goes. It sounds pretty crazy. You can see the steam rising up out of the sides. If your oven is dirty, sometimes it can cause the smoke alarm to go off. Just be prepared for that. The oven here is pretty clean, so that shouldn't happen. And that'll continue to steam up the interior for the next 10 minutes or so. Now I'm going to keep the oven light on so that I can take a look at it as it rises. And I'm looking for not just golden brown, but a little bit on the darker side of that crust to make sure that everything has baked properly before I take it out. Alright, so the bread is done baking now, so we're going to take this out of the oven. I didn't really time it, I just checked to see if it was the right color. So there it is. See how it's almost, it's darker than just golden brown. And pretty quickly, I'll flip these over. And I don't have a drying rack, or a cooling rack rather. So I just flip them over on their sides so that as much surface area is in the air as possible. And it works fine that way as well. Here are the bowls. They're sort of stuck together, but it's not going to hurt anything. Turn the oven light off. And then just do the same with these. You can see since these bowls were on the bottom rack, the bottom got a little bit darker. And that's all you need to know. I would let these cool for about 10 minutes before cutting into them, just for the reason that they might compress or sort of deflate if you don't give them a chance to cool down. But we'll cut into them as soon as they've cooled a little bit, and you can see the final result. Now that we've given the bread a chance to cool down, we can check to see how it turned out. Giving it a little squeeze around the crust, I can hear it crackle. Hopefully that noise shows up a little bit. But that means that steaming the oven worked out, and then we've got a nice crispy crust. Let's cut on in. It helps to have a serrated knife to get through that tough crust. Now these are some good signs here. As you can see, the size of the bubbles inside of the crumb of the bread are very different, and there are some big pockets here and there. That means that the dough was able to proof correctly, and it's nice and light and airy rather than dense and compact. Let's try it. Very good flavor. So if for any reason your bread didn't turn out this way, a couple of things may have gone wrong. Maybe while you were forming the bread, you patted down on it too hard and got rid of all the air bubbles, or you didn't allow it to rise for long enough, which didn't allow those bubbles to sort of get large enough and create an airy crumb. If for some reason, even after taking it out of the oven, the bread hasn't risen and gotten nice and round like this, it could be because you left it to rise for too long and it sort of collapsed before it had a chance to bake. Just amend the time that it takes to do each of these steps and experiment to try and get the best result in however it is that you prefer it.